Today is 7th November, and that brings us one calendar month from the start of the present fighting in Israel and the Palestinian territories. 7th of October, of course, was the day when Hamas launched its attack on southern Israel, starting the current sequence of events. And as always, there is a great deal of confusion and fog of war about what is going on the battle lines. But I'm going to say straight away that latest maps that I've seen suggest that some of the claims that were being made, that I repeated in my program yesterday, and let me repeat again, I am very dependent here on reporting by others. Anyway, some of the claims that appeared to have been made of Israeli progress in the fighting in Gaza, I think I must now draw back on. It seems that the Israeli troops, have not yet managed to reach the sea, that the separation, that the division, the split of northern Gaza from southern Gaza, the creation of two pockets, well, that is premature. It hasn't yet happened. Also, it seems that the claims that the Israelis have advanced close to the hospital beneath which they believe that this vast Hamas bunker complex is located. Well, I've seen some reports which have suggested that those claims also might be rather premature, though I noticed in the Daily Telegraph today that the Daily Telegraph is repeating those claims about Israeli troops being very close to the bunker complex and to this particular hospital. So it may be the case, in fact, it strongly looks as if it is the case, that Israel has made less progress in this operation, this military operation, than I had assumed was the case in the program yesterday. So for that, perhaps I should say apologies, though again, let me repeat once more, I am very dependent on reporting from the ground, and I think this particular war, this particular fight that's taking place in Gaza is particularly difficult to report upon, because, to say it straightforwardly, I don't think that there are any fully independent reporters on either side, and we have to just take the information as it comes, and it becomes only possible after a while to piece together a clearer picture of what has happened. Meanwhile, bombing by Israel of Gaza continues unabated, as far as I can understand, and rocket attacks by Hamas on Israel also continue, though, to be clear, the Israeli bombing of Gaza is having a devastating impact. The Hamas rockets on Israel are pinprick attacks, and I haven't heard information about any Israeli civilian casualties as a result of these rocket attacks for some time. So there we go. That seems to me the overall picture of the situation on the ground. Now, there are many claims about losses on that the losses that each side is inflicting upon the other. Yesterday, I said on the basis of a fairly well-sourced piece of information that I'd received privately, or at least it looked to me very well-sourced, that Israel had perhaps lost around 12 tanks over the course of the ground fighting in Gaza. Today, I've been told by someone else that the actual number of tanks destroyed is around 80. I suspect that is significantly too high. I'm going to stick with the information I was given yesterday. But anyway, there is, as we can see, a great deal of fog of war. It does seem as if Israeli progress may be slower than I had assumed. In fact, comparing some of the more recent maps that I have seen, the ones which show Israel some distance, the Israeli troops some distance from the sea as they try to cut the Gaza Strip in two, comparing those maps with some other maps that I had seen some days ago, I'm going to go even further. I would say that for the moment at least, the Israeli ground operation actually seems to be at something of a standstill. But let me reiterate once more that Israel obviously has overwhelmingly greater military power that it can bring to bear. I'm assuming that if the Israelis do set their mind to it, they will eventually be able to battle through and reach the sea, only they haven't managed to do that yet. So, fighting continues unabated, diplomacy also continues unabated, and there is growing signs of frustration on the part of the US administration with the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu, and there are growing signs of frustration within the United States, amongst the leadership of the Democratic Party, to be even more specific, with President Biden. We've seen more demands in the United States, which I will come to shortly, for President Biden not to step down. Nobody yet is suggesting this, but suggestions that perhaps he ought to reconsider his intention to seek re-election as president in the presidential election next year. Anyway, let's just, before we turn to what the US is saying about the Israelis and what the Democrats are saying about President Biden, let's first of all discuss briefly what the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman has been saying about the situation in Gaza. He has spoken out in this way. He says, this is the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman, the soaring death toll of Palestinian civilians and catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza is an outrage to human conscience, an affront to fundamental international norms, and a tragedy that can no longer be allowed to go on by the global community. Now, the reason I'm singling out this statement amongst scores of others, there have been lots of statements by Arab leaders, by Iranian leaders, by leaders around the global south. President Maduro of Venezuela, for example, has weighed in. South Africa, whose president, by the way, is, as I understand it, engaged in a summit meeting with the Chinese president, President Xi Jinping, who has spoken about relations between South Africa and China being in a period of a golden age. South Africa, of course, being, like China, a member of the BRICS. Anyway, lots of statements of that kind going around, and of course the South Africans coming back to them. They've recalled their diplomatic staff from Israel and have said that they're also reviewing and reconsidering their relationship, their position in relation to the Middle East, and perhaps their long-term relations with Israel as they consider what is happening, review what is happening in Gaza and on the Palestinian territories. Well, the reason I singled out this statement by the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman is because China is about to assume chairmanship of the UN Security Council. The Chinese, as I have discussed yesterday, have already pointed out that the simplest, most effective way of achieving a ceasefire in Gaza is for the United States to drop its veto in the UN Security Council, allowing a resolution calling for a ceasefire to pass. And pressure is going to increase for this to happen. We can see that the Chinese not only are preparing to use their chairmanship of the Security Council to facilitate the passing of a resolution by perhaps setting the Security Council's agenda, programming meetings, scheduling meetings in a particular way. But the Chinese also, and this is what the Foreign Ministry spokesman's words imply, are also going to work to put even further together that international coalition that will eventually call for a ceasefire. And that is what the last words in this statement, which, by the way, the Chinese Foreign Ministry has published on X. Anyway, that is what those last words, a tragedy that can no longer be allowed to go on by the global community, implies. Notice that the Chinese speak about a global community. They don't like to use the words international community. International community has been used very heavily by the United States, and it is come to be seen around the world. The words international community have come to be seen as diplomatic shorthand for the United States and its friends. So the Chinese prefer to use the expression global community instead. Anyway, they're clearly working together with their other BRICS friends to move forward with a resolution in the Security Council. And the pressure on the United States is growing, and the United States is increasingly feeling that pressure, both as its own position in the Middle East and globally starts to erode, and as polling numbers, the president's polling numbers in the United States tumble. Now, before I proceed to discuss the international developments, let me say that there's now been an article in Politico which provides the text of what purports to be, in fact what I have no doubt actually is, a letter that is circulating amongst disaffected officials within the US State Department, making it absolutely clear that they disagree strongly with the president's policy. And the policy, of course, that they are disagreeing with is the policy of giving Israel, in effect, a blank check. One State Department official apparently has already resigned. So far he is only one, but anyway, this is a letter, as I said, that has been published or circulated in connection with this particular, with people who are unhappy about this particular policy. And I am not going to dwell on this letter because I'm not entirely sure how many people exactly have signed it. I did notice that what seems to have bothered the diplomats who are supporting this letter is that they're worried about the impact of policy, of the US's policy, of what they choose to call the what they continue to call the rules-based international order. So anyway, even in the heart of the US establishment, it appears that there is growing concern that the policies of the United States, the policies of the president, are starting to undermine the position, the actions of the policies, the policy positions, the geopolitical positions of the United States. Now, we've been hearing rumours about this for some time. So far, I have to say, there's been no clear-cut, open revolt. As I said, one official apparently resigned sometime in October, but others are sticking by their jobs. We haven't yet seen open letters being addressed to the media with lots of signatories, so it's difficult to assess quite how extensive this dissent is. But nonetheless, it does seem that dissent does exist, and I suspect that over the next couple of days and weeks, within the foreign policy establishment of the United States, it will start to spread. So that's one area where the administration is coming under pressure. Clearly, they will not want to have a general turn of US diplomats coming out and speaking out against the administration's policies. That will be very difficult for the United States, for the administration, for President Biden altogether, and it will be very difficult for Secretary of State Tony Blinken as well. But if, as I said, there is pressure of that kind on the administration, they're trying to respond to it by putting their own pressure on Israel and on President Netanyahu, or Prime Minister Netanyahu in particular. And there's been an article about all of this, outlining the kind of moves that the administration is trying to take, and it comes from, of all places, the Daily Telegraph, a newspaper in Britain which has been outspoken in its unequivocal support for Israel and, by extension, for Prime Minister Netanyahu's government and policies. And the article discusses the various diplomatic moves that the United States is trying to take. And we read, for example, that on Sunday, Tony Blinken made a surprise stop to see Mr. Abbas, that's President Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority, in the West Bank. And we're told that the main topic of discussion does not seem to have been a ceasefire. Well, that's doubtful, actually, temporary or otherwise, but a conversation about the future role of the Gaza Strip. It's something Mr. Netanyahu and his nationalist religious coalition have given no obvious thought to, but which the United States and much of the rest of the world is desperate to see resolved. And the article that goes on to say that the US, Tony Blinken, asked Mahmoud Abbas, are you prepared to take over the government of Gaza? And apparently, or supposedly, President Abbas said yes. Well, I've already discussed this, how this is almost certainly not an idea that was at all at the forefront of President Abbas's mind or that of his officials. In fact, they made it absolutely clear that for them, for the moment, their priority is to seek a ceasefire in Gaza. But the key point about the article is that it goes on to say that this reflects this approach that is being taken by the United States, this reach out to Prime Minister Abbas. In fact, it reflects US frustration, deep US frustration with Prime Minister Netanyahu. And they talk about how Prime Minister Netanyahu has, up to this point, until fairly recently, sought to play a game of divide and rule with the Palestinians by pressuring very heavily the moderate, secular Palestinian Authority on the West Bank by covertly supporting Hamas in Gaza. Now that is, let me reiterate again, what the Daily Telegraph is saying. And this policy, now the administration has apparently decided, has been a complete failure. And this partly explains the recent outreach by the administration to President Abbas. And the article goes on to say, in recent days, the United States administration is reported to have become increasingly frustrated with the Israeli leadership. It is partly about the conduct of the war. They would like to see more infantry and fewer airstrikes, but also about the Israeli leadership's refusal to consider what comes next. The leak of an Israeli intelligence document last week, which ruminated on decanting Gazans en masse into Egypt, did not go down well. And in fact, we've had further statements from the United States, including a statement that was agreed by Tony Blinken with President Abbas during his visit to the West Bank, that the United States opposes the transfer of the entire population of Gaza to Egypt or anything like that. And there have been more statements to that effect now from US officials. Now, again, I think here we need to be rather more sceptical of these claims and of the claims that we've just seen in the Daily Telegraph, this article in the Daily Telegraph about how the United States is unhappy with these Israeli policy positions, with this Israeli policy of trying to expel the population from Gaza. It was absolutely obvious to me, and it was, I think, to most observers, that in the first weeks of this particular crisis, when Tony Blinken was going to Egypt and Olaf Scholz was also going to Egypt and meeting with the King of Jordan and other officials, other Arab officials, the policy at that time absolutely was to try to get the Egyptians to open the border crossings so as to persuade, or if you prefer, coerce the population of Gaza to transfer into Sinai. And there was discussions at that time about getting Qatar to finance a tent city where these refugees would go whilst the fighting in Gaza continued. So certainly at one point the administration was definitely, at least this is my own clear view, was definitely going along with this Israeli policy and was actually trying to facilitate it. It became absolutely clear that the Arab leaders were completely, solidly opposed to it, that they saw it as another attempt by Israel to annex and bring under its control and occupy more Arab and Palestinian land, to continue the process of displacement which the Arabs consider began when Israel was founded in 1948, and the Arabs completely rejected that whole idea. And of course the Egyptian president not only rejected the idea but was rude to Secretary of State Blinken when the two met, and ensured that the entire meeting was filmed, and that the film was then widely circulated. Anyway, that plan has had to be abandoned, and I discussed how about a week ago now, President Biden himself eventually spoke to President al-Sisi of Egypt and assured President al-Sisi that population displacement was not something that the United States contemplated or supported. On the contrary, it now opposed it, and the Americans have given similar assurances to other Arab leaders, to MBS in Saudi Arabia, to the King of Jordan, and now Tony Blinken did the same to President Abbas on the West when he met him on the West Bank. But anyway, we're now told that the US was not happy about the fact that there was an Israeli intelligence document which ruminated on this decanting of Gazans en masse into Egypt. So what the United States was supporting 2 weeks ago, it now opposes and is unhappy when it becomes known that Israel has been considering. And then we're told that the US was also unhappy with Heritage Minister Amichai Eliyahu's suggestion this weekend that dropping a nuclear bomb on Gaza was an option. Well, if they are unhappy about it, they've been very careful to be extremely quiet about expressing that unhappiness, but never mind. And that they're also unhappy with Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich's call on Monday for the creation of sterile, no-go areas for Palestinians on the West Bank. So that's all in the Daily Telegraph. And by the way, on the topic of the West Bank, there's now another article, this time in The Economist, also a magazine which generally is very supportive of Israel, say that the situation on the security situation on the West Bank is deteriorating. It talks straightforwardly about settler violence, Israeli settler violence against the Palestinian population, and speaks with alarm about how this violence, this spiral of violence, is now threatening to get out of control and could spark at any time a Palestinian uprising on the West Bank. In which case, of course, the Israelis will be fighting in Gaza and they'll be having to control an uprising on the West Bank at one and the same time. But anyway, let's continue with the Daily Telegraph article. And we now have a quote from a person familiar with the US administration's thinking. We don't know who this person is, but this is a quote which the Daily Telegraph is taking from what this person has said to the Washington Post, I should say. But anyway, we're told that this person told the Washington Post they're watching a train wreck and they can't do anything about it. And the trains are speeding up. The train wreck is in Gaza, but the explosion is in the region. And then we are told, and this is now the Daily Telegraph again, that Mr. Blinken had to spend part of his diplomatic tour, the diplomatic tour that I've discussed yesterday and in my programme the day before, and which Alex Christoforou and I have also discussed in a programme which we've done on the Duran. Anyway, we're told that Mr. Blinken had to spend part of his diplomatic tour, which took in Jordan, Iraq and Turkey, as well as the West Bank, putting out unnecessary fires. The administration is opposed to the forced relocation of Palestinians from Gaza to neighbouring Egypt, he told Mahmoud Abbas when they met in Ramallah on Sunday. And this is according to a report in the Jerusalem Post. They also spoke about the need to stop extremist violence against Palestinians and hold those accountable responsible. And that, of course, is a reference to the settlers. And we're then told, there's a quote from somebody called Professor Treitenberg, that the Americans would not be able to force the creation of an Israeli coalition that was more amenable to change, but they could greatly increase the chances of that happening. They have real leverage, perhaps for the first time, and not just in terms of financial aid that runs to about $4 billion a year. They are really playing a very significant part of the war. Israel relies on their systems, their munitions, the deterrence of their ships. They have a seat on the table. The question for Mr. Netanyahu is how long will he have a seat? And might Mr. Abbas, 13 years his senior, outlast him? So, the Americans, this is the overall take from this article in the Daily Telegraph. They're not happy with Prime Minister Netanyahu. They're afraid, they're concerned that the situation is out of control. They're deeply frustrated, both with Prime Minister Netanyahu and some of his officials, Amichai Eliyahu, Finance Minister Smotrich. They want a change of policy. They're complaining that this is a train wreck. The words of someone familiar with the US administration's thinking, not my words. They're watching a train wreck and they can't do anything about it, and the trains are speeding up. The train wreck is in Gaza, but the explosion is in the region. So, worries about a regional war, obviously. Worries also about the disintegrating diplomatic position of the United States, geopolitical position of the United States in the Middle East, and growing worries that they're losing ground all the time diplomatically, that there will be more moves before long in the United Nations and the Security Council and in the General Assembly, with the Chinese now in pole position to move forward with any Security Council resolutions that they want to propose, calling for a ceasefire or something else. So the US very much now on the back foot. And in fact, I've discussed the other train wreck, which was Secretary of State Blinken's trip round the Middle East. I'm going to suggest that it is not a coincidence that articles like this, the one in the Daily Telegraph, the one in the Washington Post that the Daily Telegraph cited, the article in The Economist that I have also cited, it is not a coincidence that these articles are appearing now in conjunction with that disastrous trip that Tony Blinken has made across the Middle East. The Daily Telegraph is trying to spin the meeting between Abbas and Tony Blinken as some kind of success, when of course it wasn't. The Palestinian Authority, for the moment, is not showing very much interest, actually, in taking back control of Gaza. What they want, above all, is an end to the fighting, and even the Daily Telegraph confirms that when the suggestion of the Palestinian Authority taking back control of Gaza was put to President Abbas, he apparently replied, "We will fully assume our responsibilities within the framework of a comprehensive political solution that includes all of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip." In other words, the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, said that yes, they want above all a ceasefire, but they also want a structured approach towards the setting up of a Palestinian state, perhaps led by themselves, but including the West Bank East Jerusalem, and Gaza. And that's the only thing that they're prepared to discuss at the present time. So, there we go. A very difficult diplomatic situation. And it's clear that Secretary Blinken came up with essentially the same message wherever he went. He came up with the same message in Jordan, in Iraq. He came up against the same message in Turkey. The meetings in Turkey seem to have gone extremely badly. And as he left Turkey, a Turkish official was quoted as saying that the United States was giving Israel impunity to do what it is doing in Gaza. Now, for his part, Prime Minister Netanyahu, unsurprisingly, is showing no sign of moving. He has given interviews in which he has again poured cold water on the idea of a ceasefire in Gaza, and he is now speaking as of today about Israel having some kind of indefinite security role in Gaza. In other words, he seems to be now that the option of transferring the population of Gaza into Egypt has at least been put off. He seems to be thinking again about some kind of military reoccupation of Gaza by Israel. So he is continuing to take an increasingly hard line. But we are also now getting reports that were appearing again in the British media yesterday that the administration, looking at the deterioration of the diplomatic position, seeing this impossible task, realizing the impossible task that Secretary Blinken gave himself over the course of that visit, and noting over that course of that Middle East trip, and noting the debacle of that trip, that yesterday there were reports in the British media, and I believe in the US media as well, that the administration is now behind the scenes talking, pressuring to the extent that they can Prime Minister Netanyahu and his officials to agree to some kind of humanitarian pause. They want a scaling down, apparently, of the Israeli assault on Gaza, and they want urgently some kind of humanitarian pause. Prime Minister Netanyahu to announce a humanitarian pause. Now, it needs to be said that they have only very limited leverage. When the official, the person familiar with the Biden administration's thinking told the Washington Post that this was a train wreck, that the administration could do nothing to prevent, well, that is to a great extent true. The administration gave Prime Minister Netanyahu his blank check to pursue whatever military solution he wished in Gaza. That was the effect of President Biden's disastrous visit of some weeks ago to Israel, which I've discussed extensively on my programs. And there's been a very interesting article by the economic historian Adam Tooze discussing the situation of the Israeli economy. And Adam Tooze does take the view that a prolonged war for Israel is probably unsustainable, that Israel's economy is already starting to experience stresses under the impact of the war. But he also points out that the Israeli economy has recently been running significant trade surpluses, that the result is that Israel has accumulated financial reserves of around $170 billion, which is a huge amount of money for such a small country, and that they can probably continue to fund the war for quite a long time, and that, bluntly, the $4 billion that they get from the United States in aid nowadays is neither here nor there. And I'm sure that is right. Now, there is one way that the United States could impose leverage on Israel, and that is, of course, they could tell the Israelis that they will no longer resist requests, applications in the UN Security Council from Arab states or other states, resolutions to the Security Council that propose a ceasefire. The US could tell Prime Minister Netanyahu that unless he agrees to a humanitarian pause and scales down the fighting, then they will support, either by abstaining or even by voting in favour, a draft resolution in the Security Council calling for a ceasefire. But that, of course, would involve the administration in a whole different set of problems. Problems within the United States. It would infuriate Israel's still very large support base in the United States. It would create major problems between the administration and the Israeli government. I suspect any sort of Israeli government, and for the moment it doesn't seem to be what the administration wants to do. Eventually, as I said, the likelihood is that the pressure for a resolution, either from the Security Council or from the General Assembly, will become overwhelming. But for the moment, I still don't think we are at that point. So that leverage that the United States does have, I don't think for the moment they are prepared to exercise. So, there we are. What does the administration do? Well, I don't know. I suspect that they will continue to try to lean on Prime Minister Netanyahu to moderate his actions, the actions of the Israeli government in Gaza. But the reality is that Prime Minister Netanyahu, for the moment, holds the political and strategic initiative. Events will be dictated by what happens on the ground. If the Israeli military operation in Gaza is successful over the next few weeks, then, as I said previously, Prime Minister Netanyahu will come out the winner. If it is not, then the situation will change completely, and Prime Minister Netanyahu will gradually start to lose support in Israel as well, and at that point US pressure might start to have an effect, but as I said already, we're not there yet. And of course, in the meantime, the risk of a general conflagration in the Middle East remains extremely high, and The Economist is ringing alarm bells about what might happen in the West Bank, where the security situation is deteriorating as well. Now, I'm going to say, if we do get an uprising on the West Bank and the fighting in Gaza continues, then of course the pressure on Hezbollah and other Shia militias to intervene in some form in the war might become overwhelming, and that will increase the risk of an overall Middle East conflagration to exponentially. And of course, if Hezbollah does become involved and does start to intervene in northern Israel at one and the same time that there's an uprising on the West Bank and fighting in Gaza, then at that point Israel itself might start to feel stretched, though I still believe that the Israeli armed forces would probably be large enough and strong enough to contain even that kind of crisis. But at that point, the pressure for the United States to intervene as well might grow. So the United States itself, short of options, must be very worried about the situation. And again, we can see why, looking at the situation as it is, we're seeing that some officials, some people in the administration are apparently worrying that the train wreck in Gaza might lead to an explosion in the whole region. Anyway, that's what's happening in the Middle East for the moment. It's what's happening in Gaza and in the Middle East. But at the same time, all of this is having an overspill effect on the position of the president in the United States. I discussed yesterday how the latest opinion polls are showing a steep fall in support for the president 1 year from the election, with the president now being outpolled by his likely Republican rival Donald Trump in 5 out of 6 of the battleground states. And perhaps more ominously for the president, David Axelrod, one of Barack Obama's former advisors, a person who's still believed to be very close to Barack Obama, has now come out and has made statements to the effect that the president should reconsider his decision to stand for re-election next year. Axelrod praises the president in effusive terms, but he makes it fairly clear that he thinks that the president should go. Now, again, let me stress, it's not being suggested that the president go immediately. Nobody so far across the political system is saying that he should resign. They're simply saying that he should announce his decision not to seek re-election in November. However, this is not quite as straightforward as it looks. Firstly, Axelrod, as I have said, is known to be close to Obama. There must be suspicions that Axelrod has received Obama's agreement, or perhaps even prompting, to say what he has said. And if so, that would be a very severe blow for the president, given the enormous prestige President Obama, former President Obama, still has in the Democratic Party. And it's perhaps worth bearing in mind that the primary reason why President Biden gained the Democratic Party's nomination in the run-up to the 2020 election was because Barack Obama, at a critical moment in the primaries, when Bernie Sanders was actually ahead in the delegate vote, Barack Obama came out and openly supported Joe Biden, phoned up various other candidates for the Democratic Party's nomination, persuaded them to stand down and announce their support for Joe Biden, and eventually even Bernie Sanders was persuaded to stand down as well, though that took a little longer. So to a certain extent, to a great extent, Joe Biden owes his position as president to Obama himself. Obama, after all, brought him to the center of power in Washington by making him his vice president, and critically, he took this critical step during the 2020 election process to ensure that it would be Biden who would be the Democratic Party's nominee for the presidency. So if word gets out that Obama thinks that Biden is not the right person to lead the Democrats in the election next year, that will be an extremely heavy blow. One which, in my opinion, the president would not be able to survive. I think that the pressure on him at that point to announce that he is leaving, that he's not going to seek re-election, will become overwhelming. But of course the intrigue goes further, because given the multiple crises that are taking place around the world, the one in the Middle East, which we've seen is proving so difficult, given the crisis that we're seeing take place in Ukraine, which is also not going well, to put it mildly, given that there are likely to be severe problems within the US economy next year. There's increasing concerns that the budgetary situation is getting out of control, and that that is compelling the Federal Reserve Board to keep interest rates high, and that might in turn lead to some kind of recession next year. Anyway, given all of these concerns, if the president says that he is not standing for re-election next year, despite the fact that no one at the moment is suggesting that he actually resign as president, I would suggest that there is at least a real chance that if he says that he is not standing for re-election and makes himself in effect a lame duck president, then calls for him to resign will start to grow, because people will say that the situation around the world, in the Middle East, in Ukraine, elsewhere, in the economy possibly, is now so bad that the United States cannot afford a lame duck president, one who is so visibly old and out of touch, and who has shown an inability to keep control of the situation. And within the Democratic Party, they will say that it will be essential also for the president to allow more space, political space, for his successor moving forward, his successor who will lead the Democrats into the presidential election. And most Democrats, probably Obama himself, most of the senior Democrats, I should make it clear, probably have calculated that the only real option is Kamala Harris. Now, Kamala Harris does not have good polling numbers either, but I can certainly see how the calculation might be that as a president, she might be in a stronger position to win election next year than she would as vice president to a lame duck president, Joe Biden, who is losing control of all of these crises around the world. So I think that Axelrod's intervention is perhaps significant, and though, to be very clear, the precipitating event is the decline in the president's polling numbers. As has been often said, in politics, everything is connected. The reason the president's polling numbers are falling is because of the perception that he's not handling well the situation in the Middle East. And we've seen admissions that he's not handling the situation in the Middle East well. We're watching a train wreck and we can't do anything about it. What is that if not an admission of powerlessness? So the president is unable to get control of the situation in the Middle East. I can very well see how the view might start to be taking hold that the president himself should step aside, someone else should take over, perhaps with a completely reconstructed foreign policy and security team, so that they can at least try to get a grip on the situation. Anyway, we will see how this all turns out, but these are certainly interesting times and very dangerous times, and of course, even as these intrigues in Washington continue, intrigues in amongst the political class there, the terrible fighting, the war, the deaths in Gaza, the violence in the West Bank, the stress within Israel itself, all of that continues unabated, and the chances of a conflagration in the Middle East remain undiminished. Anyway, we will see. It seems to me that perhaps for the last time in the history of the Middle East, the decisive decisions now are going to be made in Washington. And the US still retains the ultimate leverage to shape events, but it's probably the case that he will not be able to do that with this president and this administration. And I'm starting to get the sense that there is a growing consensus in Washington that recognizes that fact, and that explains some of the recent things that we're starting to hear, including these comments from David Axelrod. Anyway, we shall see what happens. In the meantime, even as intrigues are starting to happen in Washington, in Ukraine we're also seeing intrigues in Kiev, and they're intrigues of an entirely different and frankly much more serious nature. Briefly, yesterday reports started to circulate about the death of a senior advisor of General Zaluzhny, the military commander of the Ukrainian armed forces. And this has been a most bizarre and strange affair altogether. But briefly, what seems to have happened is this, that Major Gennady Chastyakov, who, as I said, is apparently a friend and assistant of General Zaluzhny, died on the occasion of his birthday in his apartment. About the one thing everybody agrees about is that he was killed whilst handling a live grenade. Now that seems a very odd thing to do, to handle a live grenade on one's birthday. And I should say that it wasn't just Chastyakov who was killed, but apparently his son was injured as well. And there is now a great deal of speculation about what happened. Now, the Ukrainian police issued a statement that he was handling this grenade on his birthday, and that gave the impression that this was some kind of an accident. Then General Zaluzhny stepped in and spoke about his loss, his sense of loss, about the death of his friend, and then reports started to circulate that in fact the story was rather more complicated than had first looked like being the case. And it seems that Major Chastyakov received a present from another military official, which included a decanter of whiskey and drinking glasses, shot glasses, presumably to drink the whiskey from, which were made to look like hand grenades. And in order to use these shot glasses, you had to pull the pin. And Major Chastyakov took one of these shot glasses, pulled the pin, and it turned out to be a live grenade, and it was what killed him. Now, if this account is correct, and as I said, these are very garbled accounts so far, it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that what happened was not an accident or a suicide attempt, which I've also seen some people suggest. It starts to look like an assassination, that Chastyakov was given this gift, and the gift included this concealed hand grenade, which is made to look like a shot glass for whiskey, and it was actually intended to kill him, which of course is what it did. Now, all of this is coming at the same time that there is this intense political struggle between General Zaluzhny and President Zelensky. General Zaluzhny has recently given an interview to The Economist in which he has said that Ukraine is at stalemate, there's not going to be any breakthrough, the offensive has failed, and Ukraine is in a war of attrition which it is losing. That was the essence of what General Zaluzhny was saying. And we've been getting reports in the media in the West about, and specifically from NBC, that President Zelensky increasingly depicted as a moody, delusional, out of touch person, hiding most of the time in a bunker, that President Zelensky continues to want to pursue Ukraine's maximalist demands. He is still intent on victory, and the report suggested, well, we've seen clear signs that Zelensky was furious with Zaluzhny's interview with The Economist, and he's been taking steps now to sack generals, as I've discussed in recent programs. So into the middle of this quarrel between Zelensky and Zaluzhny, we get this assassination of one of Zaluzhny's senior aides, and a person who was apparently a personal friend of Zaluzhny's. And this, coming from a political system, the Ukrainian political system, where assassinations have become a commonplace. I say that, it's no longer denied that Ukrainian intelligence has been behind various assassinations that have taken place in Russia, and various assassination attempts also. Recently, there was an assassination attempt of a former Ukrainian politician, Oleg Tsarov, an opponent of the Maidan movement, and a former senior member of former President Yanukovych's Party of the Regions, who is now living in exile in Crimea. I would say in exile, though of course Oleg Tsarev now apparently considers himself to be a Russian. Anyway, there was an assassination attempt, which, by the way, he survived. He's now giving interviews. But the thing to say about Tsarev is that before the Russians launched the special military operation, the British named him as a possible leader of a government, a Ukrainian government, that the Russians might install in place of President Zelensky. And there have been suggestions that this assassination attempt on Tsarev might have been ordered by members of Zelensky's entourage in order to remove this from the scene a potential rival. Well, it looks a little far-fetched to me, and I don't think myself that Tsarev has any role in Ukrainian politics, but in a fraught and paranoid atmosphere, who knows what people might be thinking and what they might do. And now, as we've seen, we've had this assassination attempt, this assassination of one of Zaluzhny's senior aides. I say that because I don't really see what other interpretation one can place on this death of General Chastyakov, given the known facts. Well, it seems to me that the political crisis that we've been talking about in Ukraine is now obviously spiraling out of control. If people are starting to kill each other in this kind of way, then we are talking about a very severe political crisis indeed. Where it's going, how it's going to turn out, who will succeed and who will lose out, about that I'm not going to comment further. And by the way, I ought to say that though this assassination attempt does seem to me to be linked to this quarrel between Zaluzhny and Zelensky, I'm not suggesting that President Zelensky himself ordered it. I've no evidence to suggest that. But I can very well imagine that there are all kinds of people on the extreme nationalist side of Ukrainian politics who might also have been furious with General Zaluzhny's interview to The Economist. And of course, there have been suggestions. There was a suggestion some time ago in the London Times that Kyrylo Budanov, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence, that he himself is one of these extreme hardliners. The most likely explanation to me of this event is that this was intended more as a warning to General Zaluzhny than anything else. I said that I expect that it's likely that he will be sacked before long, that he will be made the scapegoat for the failure of the offensive. That's how it looks to me. That's what the Time magazine article was basically hinting at. It spoke about Ukrainian officials close to Zelensky speaking about a major reshuffle and a dismissal of a top Ukrainian general. So Zaluzhny seems to be most likely that person. And this looks to me like a warning, perhaps from someone close to Budanov, or Budanov himself, or someone like that, to Zaluzhny, not to try anything in the event that he is sacked, and a reminder of the ruthlessness of some of the people in the political system within Kiev that he would be going up against. So there we go. Now, President Zelensky himself has taken a further step to try to shore up his political position. A couple of days ago, there was increasing talk, undoubtedly encouraged by people in the West, especially in the United States, about elections, parliamentary elections, parliamentary and presidential elections taking place in Ukraine next year. And under immense pressure, President Zelensky seemed to be going along with that idea. And I understand there was even a vote proposed to the Ukrainian parliament authorizing these elections, which up to now the Ukrainian government, President Zelensky, had appeared to rule out. So it looked as if he was relenting in his opposition to elections. And as I said, we had moves in the parliament which seemed to intend to allow these elections to take place. Well, that only lasted for a couple of hours, because yesterday President Zelensky came out and made a public statement that there weren't going to be any elections, that the whole idea of elections was unworkable while Ukraine is at war, and that the elections therefore have to be called off. This is happening in conjunction with the collapse of President Zelensky's polling numbers. I saw a opinion poll that's been taken in Ukraine, which showed that trust in the Ukrainian government amongst Ukrainians has collapsed from 73% in June to 39% now. So there's been a collapse in support and trust for President Zelensky's government. And besides, I'm fairly sure that President Zelensky himself calculated that the call for elections, which seems to be coming mainly from the West, was anyway part of a complicated exercise in getting him shuffled off the scene, and that was something he moved, therefore, to stop. So, complicated intrigues in Ukraine, but in the meantime the war goes on. And there have been reports that the Russians continue to push hard in Kupiansk and Avdiivka. Not very, the information from both of these places remains somewhat thin, but it all seems to point to continued Russian advances and to very, very severe Ukrainian losses. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians, from their part, appear to be trying to enlarge this bridgehead in Krinky on the east bank of the Dnieper that they've carved out for themselves in Kherson region. So far, apparently, they've not been very successful in this. And I'm getting the impression also that the Russians, as I said in a recent program, are probably, with the appointment of a new general, General Teplinsky, that they might be starting to move towards taking stronger steps to try to choke off this bridgehead. Certainly, the Russian Air Force has been very active in that very area recently. So the fighting goes on. The trend continues to be bad for Ukraine. And that no doubt explains the intrigues in Kiev, but these intrigues will of course have been picked up in Western capitals. They won't inspire confidence there, and to the extent that the Ukrainian people are interested in them, they won't inspire confidence in Ukraine either. Overall, I get the clear sense that gradually, slowly, perhaps before long, quickly, the sands of time on the Ukrainian clock are starting to run out. Anyway, that is my programme for today. Intrigues in Washington, intrigues of a rather more kinetic kind in Kiev. More from me soon. Just to remind you again, you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and you should also remember to check out our shop, links under this video. If you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Back soon with more reports and discussion of what's going on, and have a very good day. Until then.